RDM plans. That is the session. And then we have with us today as keynote speaker, Dr. Venkatraman. Dr. Venkatraman, to briefly introduce, did his PhD in biochemistry from University of Edinburgh and did his postdoctoral work in biomedical sciences, especially specializing in medical imaging, data curation, and related areas. And now he describes himself as an experienced advocate of best practices in research data management. So naturally, we couldn't have found a better person to give a keynote in this session, which is on RDM or the research data life cycle, because he's going to share with us his experiences of the best practices in research data management. So welcome and thank you, Venkat. Over to you now.
Thank you very much, Shalini, and thank you for having me here. I'm very honored to be here and to do this talk for you. Let me just share my screen. Hopefully you can all see that now. Okay, thank you. So, as I said, I'm so grateful to be here. I'm sorry I can't be here, there in person. I would have loved to have been, but unfortunately, work is just a little too busy at the moment, and it wasn't possible for me to be. I hope what I cover here will be in scope of what this session is going to be, and I apologize in advance if there's any overlaps with any past or future sessions that are going to come. But what I've been asked to provide an introduction to is my experiences of open science, about RDM and the FAIR principles. And just briefly about me, thank you for the introduction. So I also work for the Digital Curation Centre, which is also based in Edinburgh. And I used to work there up until last year. And now I work for this organization called OpenAIRE, which is a European organization that's European Commission or EC funded. And I'm currently their training officer there. And as Shalini mentioned previously, I was a biologist and I gained a lot of experience in these aspects of open science and etc. Through that work. Oh, I'm sorry. Technical difficulties here. There we go. And I just wanted to say that what I will be describing is perhaps a very European level, but I hope it still benefits you as well. And indeed, there's of course other regions of the world which are also conducting very important work on open science and RDM, etc. But today, I was just going to give you an overview at this stage, just to outline the landscape and the challenges, to introduce this thing called the research data lifecycle, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, and maybe this has already been discussed. Standardization methods and principles available to enrich research data and its interoperability, a word that keeps cropping up. Freely opening data for reuse so that you can add value to it, and the efforts to bring these together and how this may affect global challenges. So just a brief note about what OpenAIRE is, my current employer. It's a legal entity that was established in 2018, but actually its roots date back to 2008. And as I mentioned, it's funded by the European Commission. It's what we describe as an e-infrastructure, but we do training as well, but also with services, compute services, etc., are also involved here. We are a non-profit, actually based in Greece, but I'm actually based in the UK, and several of my colleagues work remotely. We have several countries from across Europe that are involved, whether as members or associate members. And yes, we have three main things: services, as I mentioned, training, and we also are involved in policy making as well. And since OpenAIRE has been actually around for several years, that's from 2008, we've been one of the central players in what's been happening in the European landscape. And we do cater to all different actors across the spectrum, from researchers and research managers to industry, policymakers and funders, and the public. So I just thought I'd start off with laying out some of the challenges that we may face currently, or that are still ongoing. One of the first things that I thought was important to mention is this thing that we're moving, or in the process of moving, and it's been going on for a while now, from this traditional aspect of peer-reviewed papers and publications and the associated data with them, to a more democratized way of doing things, where researchers are actually able to directly publish their own data. But this raises a lot of questions in the way this happens, and the way incentivization for it, and the reward mechanisms, and so forth. But it's a great thing that's happening, and it is truly freeing up the way research is being conducted and ultimately shared. And of course, I'm sure you've heard about this term called the data deluge. And of course, nowadays, anyone is able to publish, as I mentioned, on the web. And this means there's so much data being generated and being published out there. And this causes huge amounts of problem if it's not done in a sustainable and well-ordered manner, because the sheer volumes, especially when you think about automated systems that are capturing data, they can be immense quantities. Indeed, the volume of data is growing exponentially. I think this is actually out of date already, but by a few years. But 90% of all data in the world has been generated in just the last few years. So how to safeguard this? And good RDM, or research data management, is an essential part of this. Another aspect to consider is this idea of reproducibility. And again, this slide is actually from a few years ago, but it's still very relevant. From Nature, there was a survey of over 1,500 scientists, and they were just basically asked, is there a reproducibility crisis? And indeed, as you can see, more than half of them said, yes, there is a significant crisis. And indeed, if you were to take the slight crisis into consideration here as well, it's basically the vast majority of the respondents saying that there is some kind of crisis going on. And of course, research integrity as well is a consequence of this as well, because if we can't have reproducibility, then this core tenet of science, research integrity, will be affected. Another aspect or challenge that we have is this idea of data silos. Indeed, there are so many different repositories and databases and data sets all sitting in individual silos out there. Some we may not even know about, and others which are sitting in isolation, unable to interact with anything else. So these could be from even within one field of research, or they could be between different domains of research, for example, chemistry, biology, physics, whatever it might be. So the challenge is, at the moment, we are not able to do any crosstalk between these data sets. And what we need to do is lay some framework down, common standards, which will allow this crosstalk to happen, this interoperability, this word again that we keep hearing. So also we have to think about the global context, and I'm sure again you're very well aware of the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and there are 17 goals there, and these are part of the grand societal challenges that we need to try and tackle. And with the volumes of data that are being generated, this is crucial to be maintained with good RDM. Otherwise, it's going to amount to nothing. Indeed, there's so much data out there already, I think. I know from my own past experience in the biology field with automated methods of image capture, vast amounts of data were being captured, but they were just being siloed and not even analyzed because there just wasn't a good mechanism in place that was managing that data. That was several years ago. I genuinely hope that has changed. I'm sure it has changed, but I'm sure it still continues in other domains as well. Indeed, apart from the SDGs, there are other worldwide institutions like the World Health Organization, the World Bank, and the OECD, which are actually recognizing that good RDM, open science, etc., is a key factor to for the well-being of humanity. So I thought I would just make a quick note about the roles of librarians and indeed IT professionals, that these are changing, or has been changing for some time perhaps, that the traditional sense of what a librarian did is now changing into something that is much more far-reaching. And indeed, they're a key player in what good RDM should be with open science and etc. This is maybe being forced onto some librarians, but from my experience of having interacted with many, I know that they've embraced it very much and they relish this role. Indeed, they're part of just a wider picture. There's so many actors and players taking part in the overall research lifecycle, which I'll get to shortly, from commercial partners to publishers and policymakers, the research funders, institutional RDM policies, and so forth. These all come together to hopefully create a whole which provides for proper management of that data. So having outlined these challenges, and I'm sure there are several other challenges that could be addressed as well, but in the scope of this talk, I'll stop there for that. So the research data management and the data lifecycle. So what is this? It's basically, well, this is a simplified version that I'm showing you here of what it takes to actually the individual practical steps that you need to do to actually well document and preserve, analyze, share, etc., your data. Each of these steps requires several different tools and methods of action to actually achieve them. But fundamentally, you can place this research lifecycle into any kind of research that's ongoing out there. Indeed, research data management is the active management and appraisal of data over the life cycle of scholarly and scientific interest. And that is key here by saying that it is the active management. As I've mentioned before, so much data has been generated, which just gets captured and just siloed. Nothing happens to it. There's no actual management of it. And this is a very key thing to keep into consideration. So data management is part of good research practice. So good RDM involves a series of measures, as I showed in the previous slide, with the different components of the research lifecycle. So, for instance, file formats, open or lossless file formats are key to this, making sure that they're readable with any kind of programs, lossless in the sense that all the data is there, You don't want any kind of compressed file formats, for example. Metadata, and I'll actually describe this a little more in the next slide. But metadata is a key component of what RDM is all about. It is a fundamental consideration to make in anything that is machine readable. So also interoperability between computers, indeed between computers and humans really, is something that needs to be taken into consideration here. We're talking about the way we use common languages, controlled vocabularies and ontologies that allow different computer systems, different repositories, or whatever it might be, to actually communicate with each other. Without using controlled vocabularies and ontologies, this becomes very difficult. Unfortunately, computers haven't got the same level of intelligence, at least not yet, as humans. And so they need to be force-fed this information so that they are able to interoperate with each other. Another key aspect is licensing. And the most common form of licensing that you'll find in the research world is Creative Commons. And indeed, it is just very, very important to actually properly license your data. By doing so, you disambiguate the data and allow potential data reusers to know their rights. Without placing a license on your data, it becomes difficult for anyone else to reuse it, at least safely, in the sense that they're not contradicting any kind of legal requirements and so forth. There are also repositories, and repositories are very key in the full life cycle, essentially. Indeed, one can think that repositories are a starting point for the whole research life cycle. I frequently have encouraged any people that have attended my trainings to consider this as the first step when they're starting a project, because the repositories of where the data will actually be shared and reused by anyone out there, it's part of the long-term data preservation and the sustainability of that data. And many repositories have already made the decisions around licenses, the metadata, the file formats, the controlled vocabularies and ontologies. They will have already made those decisions for you. So indeed, as a researcher or anyone supporting those researchers, including librarians and IT professionals, if you can identify a suitable repository for that data from the start, then that actually removes all the other obstacles automatically, because those decisions have been made by the repository. And finally, the training aspect. It is indeed a key part of good RDM, that there is a good training infrastructure, and also that we have open training materials, indeed ones that are freely available and reusable out there. I should point out that these slides, you'll notice, are Creative Commons attribution license. So I will make these slides freely available afterwards. And just by indicating this, you are able to freely reuse it as long as you attribute where you get it from. As mentioned in the previous slide, metadata is at the heart of good RDM. And it is part of the bigger consideration of documentation. Metadata can be technical, it can be descriptive, and so forth. It is standardized, it is structured, and it is machine and human readable. And it helps to cite and disambiguate data and aids reuse of that data. Metadata basically accounts for everything else in that previous slide, really, because licenses, they have metadata, file formats, they have metadata. repositories, they have metadata. All of these things have metadata, and that's why we consider this to be at the heart of good RDM. Without good metadata, you will not be able to achieve any of this. And it is so important to remember that we do want to make everything we're doing here machine readable. So moving on to data sharing and openness, this is something that is complementary to good RDM. And well, let's say in this slide, I'm thinking of it as trying to reverse this cycle, or to make things as open as possible from the very beginning. Indeed, there's actually some fields of research that have been doing this for decades already, like astronomy. Images that were captured on telescopes, they were actually made freely available from the point when they were actually captured. But this needs to be extended to other fields of research, because it is something that we could do from the point of creation, within reason, of course, and there's always going to be caveats here. But I think the bulk of research is actually possible to be made open at an earlier stage than at this final stage of preservation in a repository. So we're trying to change this typical lifestyle. And this could relate to anything, whether it's the papers, because you could be using preprints as well before the final publication, the actual data, the way experiments were conducted, and indeed, let's not forget about code and software as well. These should be actually considered as a data object in themselves, and made freely available where possible, especially if they are directly pertinent to any particular analysis that's being conducted on some data object. Because without having that code, then the reproducibility of that experiment is actually in jeopardy. And that's what I mean here by saying that this supports reproducibility. So why make data available? And this slide is from Nature, but it's a quote from Ewan Birney, the joint director at the European Bioinformatics Institute. And this statement I wholeheartedly believe in as well. It was never acceptable to publish papers without making data available. Indeed, research data, most of it at least, is publicly funded. And we can think of it as the crown jewels then of the research environment. It is our data as well as the researchers' data. And we should be able to query it as much as possible if it has been publicly funded. And I think this is as good an argument as any for why we should make data open. There are also several other arguments that you could have here, that increasing wealth as well, because take, for example, the Google Maps. The images that were actually used to create Google Maps were from actually publicly funded images from Landsat, and actually they were bought and reused by Google and created into Google Maps. And that is now a multi-billion-dollar industry in itself. It's generated businesses all over the world. This is, by making it open, this is a way that generated wealth in itself. Making data open can also reduce fraud, because by allowing the public to be able to interrogate data, they can actually find any kind of fraudulent behavior. Indeed, the same argument for any mistakes that happen in any kind of research, they can be found by making things more open. It's a way of open peer review, basically. And finally, I think it also allows better interdisciplinarity. And this is one of the major things that's happening in the research domains all around the world. We are not having just the traditional siloed fields of research of, biology, chemistry, and so forth. There is so much crosstalk happening between these different fields of research, and this is being fostered by better interoperability between different repositories and so forth. It creates new fields of research, it creates new knowledge, and this is only possible by making this data open. And indeed, there are other times when you don't know what the data that is being generated could potentially be reused for. What is something of relevance in one particular field of research right now might actually be very relevant in some future field of research that we haven't even conceived yet. And so we just don't know. And the only way we can actually promote this is to actually allow the data to be freely open to everyone. So again, I'm sure this has been discussed already in the conference, but let me take you through the FAIR principles. And I like to think of it as a formalization of research data management. It indeed stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And beneath each of these letters, I've stated a few of the things that are relevant to each of these letters, whether they're persistent identifiers, repositories, file formats, ontologies, repositories, and licenses, which we've just discussed. But central to all of that, again, you will see is this metadata. And it is something very, very important to remember when you're thinking about the FAIR principles as well. It is something that's been around for the last few years, and it's really taken root in the fields of research and in publicly funded projects, especially in Europe. I can say that it forms such a huge part of what's going on here. But let's not forget about other frameworks as well. There are the CARE principles, for example, the CARE principles relating to collective benefit, authority, to control, responsibility, and ethics, and also open and responsible research and innovation. These are all very important. In fact, there are others as well, but these are considerations to be made when you're thinking about the way that this research should be conducted. Just sticking with the FAIR principles, so this slide from a few years ago, but anecdotally, I know that this is still very true. When you discuss this with researchers and other actors that are in this arena, people just don't know about what the FAIR principles are. And you need to remember that. And if you ever meet someone that doesn't know about the FAIR principles, you need to reassure them that they're not alone. This is something that we're trying to instill in people, but it's going to take time. Indeed, it is a culture change that we're trying to foster, and also something that will take a long time to do. As I mentioned, the FAIR principles are actually very central to EC, European Commission policymaking. There's this document from a few years ago called Turning FAIR into Reality. And actually, this has become a cornerstone of much of the funding calls that the EC put out. And as I'll describe later on, this is actually something that researchers really need to address when they're doing proposals as well. So the FAIR principles can be broken down into these 15 sub-principles, if you want to call it that. The best place to actually get more information on this is the gofair.org website. This details this in far more, with far more descriptions. But again, you can see here about metadata being central to this. And I highly recommend you visit this site. Some common misconceptions just to take note of though. FAIR does not have to be open, and there's a common misunderstanding about this. The two things are complementary, and we want to try and make them overlap as much, but they are distinct things. The principles don't specify any particular types of technology or implementations. The end result is what we're trying to get here. The way you try and reach that end result is up to you. So it is just a framework. It is not something that is trying to be dictatorial in that sense. And so, yes, it's not strict criteria. It's a spectrum or a continuum. It did originally start from the life sciences, but indeed it has actually branched out into all fields of research. To summarize what I just said there, so if you can imagine all the research data out there in the world, the wild, then a subset of that might be managed data, which is whatever that might mean, but it might still be disorderly in some shape or form. Then you have what we call the FAIR data, which fulfills these principles that are a bit of a gold standard of what this managed data might look like. To the side of that, we have open data. So some of this may not actually be managed data, but a lot of it will be. And indeed, some of it will overlap with what the FAIR data are doing too. And what we're trying to do essentially is try and increase this overlap between FAIR and open. This won't be entirely possible because indeed, as I mentioned to you before, FAIR does not necessarily mean open, but we have this saying in the RDM field, as open as possible and as closed as necessary. And essentially what this is trying to say is that any kinds of data which cannot be made open, for example, sensitive data, things that have human identifiers or IPR or commercial in nature, these might not be able to be possible to be made open. And that's okay, that's fine. But the idea is to try and make as much of the research data out there as open as possible. One thing I should say though, for anything that is sensitive or anything like that, there are alternative routes to try to make them as FAIR compliant as possible. And whether this might be through de-anonymization or pseudo-anonymization of patient data, for example, access rights, there are different mechanisms to how data could be released to the public or to any potential data reusers. However, instead of making the actual data itself reusable and discoverable, we encourage people to try and make the metadata actually discoverable. So that won't reveal the actual underlying data, but it will highlight to any potential data reusers that this data actually exists. And so they will be able to approach the data owners to see if they can actually get access to that data. By making this metadata searchable on a Google search or a repository search, whatever it may be, you actually show that that data exists without actually revealing its contents. So what I've described to you with RDM, open research or open science, and the FAIR principles can be neatly packaged into what we call data management plans. And this is a short document for researchers to plan the research process and how that data will be managed and safeguarded. These have existed for a long time, but really in the last few years, they've been gaining momentum and importance. Again, especially with what I highlighted earlier, with this data deluge, the volumes of digital data being generated in the research field and elsewhere, we need to make sure that they're managed properly. And data management plans are a neat, small way of actually ensuring that. My previous employer, the Digital Curation Center, they have several guides out there that you can actually use. The link is there, and as I said, these slides will be shared later. There's guidance from elsewhere too, well, in other forms. Indeed, the Digital Curation Center also have this online tool called DMP Online to create DMPs. It's a very lightweight web-based application where you can actually, it takes you through step by step what you need to actually do to fill in a data management plan or DMP. And there are templates already there for you to reuse. Depending on funder requirements and so forth, there may be actually different things that need to be filled in. This isn't the only tool. My current employer actually has a DMP tool as well called Argos. And indeed, there are several others out there, and I'm not here to try and sell all these to you. You can, I'm sure, find others if you need to. Indeed, I'm not actually sure about in India if there's any particular DMP tool out there, but these things are entirely free to use, and they're already out there. So some solutions then to what we've discussed so far. I think this has been highlighted already in this conference. Of course, we have the UNESCO recommendations on open science, which were only recently published November last year. There were draft versions of this for a long time before, but I'm glad that this is actually now finally out there. And this is such an important document in the scope of what the world is trying to do. It provides a single set of guidelines that all nations can actually look at and try to align what they're doing with what global efforts there are, or regional, of course, because we can't run before we walk with doing a lot of this. But it provides a very succinct set of recommendations that allows any institutions or countries to actually try and take up this mantle of open science. I was slightly disappointed to see that research data management wasn't explicitly mentioned in this document, but at least the overall aims of what it's trying to achieve with FAIR principles and open science is in close alignment with what I've been discussing anyway. But I was surprised that RDM itself isn't explicitly mentioned. And there are several global efforts and resources. These are just a selection here, but there's just so many things out there going on. For example, the Research Data Alliance, if you're not already a member, I highly recommend joining this. It's completely free to join up. They have 2 conferences each year, and it's a great forum for discussing with like-minded individuals in similar fields of research, or looking at similar problems to come together. And indeed, it works, the RDA works through working groups and interest groups to actually produce outputs that can be adopted by whoever, institutions, research groups, whatever, around the world. And it's a very important forum for doing so. There's also this aspect of training, which is extremely key to what we're trying to achieve here. Some things that are going on that I can mention to you. Just recently, I was involved with the writing of a book called How to Be Fair with Your Data. This is a teaching and training handbook for higher education institutions. It's out there already. I highly recommend you look at that if you want to try and promote the FAIR principles to your host institutions or elsewhere. I'm also actually involved in schools of research data science. This is backed by CoData and the RDA. And I've been involved in this for the last few years, which has allowed me to get involved with early career researchers from low and middle income countries mostly. And this has actually created foundational skills in data science, including everything that we've just talked about with RDM, etc. And it's completely free to reuse. The curriculum is out there. In fact, it is actually one of these RDA outputs that I just mentioned, and it's extremely valuable. And finally, one thing that I can also mention here that as part of OpenAIRE, which I'm leading at the moment, is just very soon, hopefully in the next coming weeks, we're going to be launching a Moodle-based platform called OpenPlato, which is going to be a source of training completely free to use for the end users in everything to do with RDM and so forth. It's on the horizon, and look out for it if you are interested. So for these solutions, again, OpenAIRE, we have developed several services which actually try to address many of these key questions that I've been describing to you. Whether it is to discover data, to publish it, or to actually monitor it as well, which is a key aspect which I've not really touched on. From the perspective of funders and policymakers, they may want to know how their research is being treated and how it's being absorbed by the wider community and so forth. And to monitor that is actually very important, especially when you think about the several millions or indeed billions of dollars that are being spent on research. And just one other major initiative that I can describe from my experiences in the European arena, at least, and that's called the European Open Science Cloud, or EOSC, as we like to call it. And this is a major initiative, and this has had, the idea for it has been in existence for a few years now, in the last decade or so. But it is still something that is gathering shape or taking shape. And it's being done by a series of projects, rounds of cycles of funding. Indeed, I'm actually currently involved in one of these projects that's ongoing. And each one of these are trying to shape what this European Open Science Cloud is all about. Essentially, it's a federated system of systems of data and of services, meaning that taking already pre-existing, in some cases, infrastructures that are dotted around Europe and trying to connect them. So we're thinking of those silos again and trying to make them interoperate with each other. But how to do this? And it's a very ambitious and very difficult project to undertake. Well, the European Open Science Cloud isn't itself a project. It's a much far-reaching thing. But the individual projects that are trying to accomplish this, yes, it is a very difficult task. It will take a lot more time. But in its current shape, there is a portal that actually allows you to go into the EOSC and find several services and data as a researcher or any other actor that I described before. It is something, as I say, that is actually freely available to use. So please do look out for it. So I think this might be some of my final slides. I just wanted to show you an example of what's happening as well in the way that the EC thinks about funding its research. And Horizon Europe is currently its current incarnation, its current round of funding. It goes on till 2027. And And basically the requirements for any researcher or whoever it might be that is making a proposal, they have to meet a set of requirements. And you'll see here that in these guidance notes for Horizon Europe, research data management is actually front and center in those requirements. These aspects need to be addressed by the applicants. Indeed, the FAIR principles are directly mentioned in the actual documentation for the proposals. And it details all these different things about types of data, findability, etc. And as I said, as a researcher, they directly have to address these points. And one of the ways that they have to do this is also to create a data management plan. In the previous round of funding called Horizon 2020, DMPs were not mandatory. They were something that were being piloted, but Horizon Europe now actually makes them a mandatory requirement. And this just signifies how important these aspects are becoming. DMPs, FAIR principles, RDM, open science, they're all central to the way the EC thinks about it. And indeed, there are other places around the world that are actually also taking note of this, and it is going to become ever more important. To summarize then, FAIR is a good extension of RDM. I want to call it maybe a gold standard, but maybe things might change in the future, who knows. But currently it is a formalized gold standard, I would say, of what good RDM should be. We want to try and make data open by default, and I've asterisked that just to signify that, of course, we talked about as open as possible and as closed as necessary. And there are going to be exceptions here, whether it's sensitive data or anything like that, there will be exceptions. And we want to increase the value of data and also increase research integrity and reduce friction in interoperability, and to promote interdisciplinarity and international, perhaps as well, research. And I think by taking all these key concepts into mind when doing these things, we will actually foster better science. Thank you very much. And well, thank you for listening. And any questions, or I don't know what's going to happen next, I'm all ears. Thank you.
Thank you, Venkat, for an exhaustive coverage of the topic of RDM, DMP, and FAIR principles and everything. I just don't want to muddy the water further by summarizing it. You have already summarized, and also in terms of time efficiency. I just want to point out that you mentioned that you are disappointed that UNESCO recommendation does not cover or does not explicitly state the RDM or the FAIR principles. I just want to say that India's STIP explicitly states about RDM as well as FAIR principles. With this, thank you once again. Are there any questions? Everyone is exhausted? Okay, thank you. Now I would like to invite our panelists. And I am the anchor for this session, so I don't have to invite an anchor. So I would like to invite the panelists, Dr. Bhakti Gala. She is an assistant professor at Central University of Gujarat. Dr. Rama Patnaik, librarian, Indian Institute of Management, Bangalore. And we have Dr. Anant Bhan, who is with an NGO called Sangath, Bhopal. He is coming online. In view of the time, I would just right away go to inviting Dr. Bhakti Gala to begin with her opening remarks. Over to you, Bhakti.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Professor Shalini Aris and the organizers of the conference for inviting me to be a part of this panel. After listening to this very exhaustive presentation, of course, there are some inputs which I will be adding here today, especially within the response from Indian institutions and academic and also the library community. Since 2017, I have, of course, been part of multiple these conferences and workshops which had some components of RDM being included in them. And today, of course, we are part of a conference which is completely dedicated to RDM, just telling us how much of mainstream this discussion has come into. I also, of course, was part of one 2017 workshop on organized at InflimNet, I remember, where we had the UK data service from the University of Essex, where the discussion had taken place. And since then, from 2015 onwards, we have also been seeing that when we look at literature which is being published in LIS journals, there's a trickling of articles being published on RDM and its applications in libraries. So within this backdrop, this is, of course, a right time for us to discuss this in the sense that I'm going to be sharing a kind of research which has been done by a scholar who is registered at our Central University of Gujarat and currently working as assistant librarian at IIT Delhi, Mr. Manu TR. We've done a pan-India survey for science and technology institutions and their awareness, acceptance of RDM, and I look forward to sharing this data. The kind of institutions we have covered in our survey were part of the government-funded, centrally government-funded institutions belonging to higher education, as well as the different departments which come under maybe Ministry of Education, DST, DRDO, ISRO's, DAE, CSIR labs, and we also approached a select sample of faculty and also principal investigators of these funded projects and the research scholars who are working under them to assess the actual status of RDM in India. So today I will be talking about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing something about what you have done about a survey of the RDM practices in some of the top top institutions in India. I would now request Dr. Rama to share her views on
Good afternoon to everyone. I'll be sharing the experience of initiating the sharing of research data. I was a part of Research Week, which is usually held every year before the doctoral conference, that is during the winter. And in that conference, I think I was invited by the dean to share some of the experiences that I had the exposure of initiating the data management, research data management in IMB. It all started with attending a conference at University of Chapel Hill at IPRES conference, and that is where I came to know that the data can also be encrypted, because there were a lot of issues associated with the sensitivity of data, because most of the data that is generated at IIM are through these consulting projects, especially done for the industry, and there were issues on how to actually encrypt and see that it doesn't go into hands which they had this own insecurities about data getting exposed or spilled over, or wherever if the library is just putting it in a server, then it should not be accessible to everyone. That was one aspect. And then the second was the dean had actually sent an email to all faculty seeking their opinion on sharing the data, because it happened that in one of the research projects, one professor from public policy, she collaborated with the project with the Netherlands University, and they were supposed to put the data in repository for the reviewer to see for validating the research project. So it is in that context that the faculty from Center for Public Policy, they said that we should have a central repository where we can at least archive the data for others to check, especially for peer reviewing process. And that is when it all initiated. I'll just talk a bit about it later. I think I just wanted to say that this is what has happened, but I'll tell in detail what.
Thank you. Our next panelist is Dr. Anant. I cannot see. Is he there? Dr. Anant Bhan?
Yeah, hi, good afternoon. Thank you. And my apologies for not being there in person, but it's a pleasure for me to join this panel. So I'm glad we're discussing data and focus on research data management. At the conference, as we've learned from this ongoing pandemic, it's crucial for us to recognize the importance of good quality evidence, and data is a crucial part of that to drive policy decision making. We've also recognized during the pandemic that the absence of this at times has exposed a major gap in the way we approach both research during pandemic times, but also non-pandemic times, but also our public health and policy responses. So I think increasingly, if nothing, the experience of dealing with the pandemic over the last couple of years should tell us the acute need for doing research data management right and using that to drive a response which is built on evidence which has been generated. Now, the challenge, I think, certainly, which we will probably deal with more in the remaining part of the session, is that when any of us, when we're conducting research, we often think of an idea and flush it out in a proposal, then we send it out for funding. The actual challenges of implementing what you had proposed to do starts when you get the funding. And it is difficult often for research organizations because they don't always anticipate what and how will they collect in terms of data, how will they store that, how will they analyze it, how will they use it, and then subsequently how will they share it. There is often a tendency to collect a lot of data. And on the converse, the challenge is that as research-based organizations, we often don't have the capacity to store this data in a secure format and be able to use it after cleaning it effectively. But of course, I think fundamentally it's important because we owe it to our funders, we owe it to our collaborators to doing good quality science, and most importantly, we owe it to our research participants who have shared data, their own lives, and elements of that with us. So I think for researchers and research institutions, it's imperative for us to start thinking about doing research data management right and building in mechanisms towards it. And of course, also focusing on what is it that we really need, what is it that we don't need, so that we don't unnecessarily collect data and then have to worry about managing it. So I think I hope a lot of these discussions in the conference will focus on some of these aspects, and I hope to touch on these in a little bit more detail later in the session. Thank you, Shalini. Back to you.
Thank you, Anant. Generally, as I mentioned in the beginning itself, that is yesterday, that our objective of this conclave was to bring all stakeholders together. And I guess in one sense, at least for this panel also, we have a practicing clinical doctor who is a researcher who is collecting data, and we also have an academic in the library information science field here with us, and we also have a practicing librarian in a management institute. Hopefully this panel will bring out some of the issues or deep dive into some of the issues of RDM. So my first question to Bhakti is that, this morning sessions, the first two sessions also brought out this issue of curriculum training for library information science professionals for this RDM as a field. But before I get into the curriculum or education and training for the LIS professionals, in my view, I also feel that it is part of the research methodology in order to bring in the researchers themselves. So the curriculum of any graduate studies particularly, if not at the earliest stage, research methods is usually one of the courses that these young graduate students take. RDM need to be included, and some of the principles, because that is how you start of seed the culture of RDM or seed the culture of data sharing. So I would like to hear from you your views on, in general, how we incorporate this RDM into the curriculum of research methods course as well as the LIS course. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shalini. This is a pretty good question, and as you mentioned earlier, it has been touched upon by the previous panel where we had academicians also discussing it. I'll of course be answering this question from two perspectives. One is my own experience, as well as what we have found as part of our survey that we did, and we had asked a direct question about this also to most of the research scholars who were participating in the study. So we, of course, as you mentioned, it has to be part of research methodology courses. We have if not at least two perspectives. One is, of course, training the librarians and then training the researchers across disciplines. And training the librarians would, of course, mean that we need to have these as a core component or at least as an elective component within the MLIS courses which are being offered. For the across the disciplines, that's what we have done at our university, is where we have proposed as part of the new NEP 2020, where we are offering it's in a proposal which has been made to offer an RDM course for research scholars who have enrolled for different PhD programs in the whole university. And this is something which is going to be like a 2-credit course, which we have proposed, which will be offered by our School of Library Information Science. And we are still in the workings of it. Secondly, of course, as part of the survey that we had done, and we had asked direct questions, as I mentioned, that the survey was done to researchers who were working in funded projects. And we had asked them whether they are, have you received any specialized training, especially for RDM? And it was interesting to find that almost 95% of the faculty themselves actually said that they had not received any training for RDM. At the same time, it was reflected also from the PhD students who were working on these funded projects, where they said they haven't received any training for this. This also gave us some data that we found interestingly, was that almost 80% of the respondents from our sample of the faculty, as well as the PIs, did not have much idea about DMPs, and also at the same time, even existing DMP tools and templates, which are already available there. And this was further elaborated upon when we asked them what kind of training would be really essential, not only as a PI, but also as from your own research scholars who are working to collect your data. And what they found, they gave us a list of kind of topics which they felt should be covered in any of these RDM training programs. And they said that they want to know more about copyright. That seemed to be on the top with all of them. Copyright, licensing, ethics of research data. They also wanted to know more about data creation and sharing, identifying different kinds of data repositories. That's another thing they want any kind of an RDM training program to have that. At the same time, how to develop a DMP, which was also touched upon by other speakers. How to store research data, again, all the technicality of it, documenting, formatting research data. These were, of course, questions which were answered by the faculty researchers, PIs. Data curation, discipline specific. We had also further had approached a lot of librarians from all of these institutions, and their responses were, of course, strikingly quite similar in their these things, and we'll be sharing about those also in my later question. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bhakti. It's nice to know that you have initiated, at least made an effort to introduce open elective and the NEP program from your department to be able to offer a course for all the research scholars in your university. That reminds me, way back, that gives you away my age. 1976, I started teaching. At that time at our university, they had introduced semester scheme, and then they were asking for innovative ideas. So at that time, literature survey was our mainstay. So I had given a proposal for giving literature survey courses to all the research scholars there. So I think from literature survey, now we have come to RDM now. Rama, may I ask you a question? You are working in a management institution, and you shared some of the concerns, particularly the diverse nature of the research that the management faculty do, because there is from statistics to finance to consultancy, public policy thing. Could you elaborate more on what are the specific challenges, especially because management institutions, IAMBs are busy in consulting and doing with the industry. So they have a specific, their research are very different. Could you share more about that?
Yeah, I think if I have to categorize the data that is being dealt by our faculty, one is the raw data that we usually get through proprietary, especially the government data, which I think unlike other countries in India, we have to buy. And we get a lot of requests from research scholars to share that. Especially the annual survey of industry and the NSSO data sets, the economic survey, they all are available in open access only in aggregated level. But if you have to do research, you need obviously at the unit level. So the raw data that we purchase usually through these rounds of ASI and NSSO, they are being processed, and they use the codes and the software algorithm. I think that is one part of it which I came to know through that research week, that that could also be archived. That is one aspect. The other is the survey data. Incidentally, I think in our institute, though we are taking these juvenile steps, but first time we had the institution of IRB. So this is Institutional Review Board, where I'm also sometimes being sent to review the proposals submitted by doctoral students and faculty, where there is a blind peer review for the proposals. In that proposal, I think in the template, it talks about how you are going to collect the data, how you anonymize the data, but there was no question on where you are going to put the data. So initially, we were not very sure how we are going to, archive that. So in that aspect, I think I came across one of the proposals where the researcher said he's going to put it on Google Drive. So that is one, I think that was a kind of eye-opener. And then I said, how could you put it on a third party? And that too, you are saying an anonymized data. So since then, the IRB template has been changed, that you can't put it any on third-party, repositories. That is one aspect. And then the lot of survey data, especially the OB area and the public policy, they actually have this survey data. So incidentally, as I said, I think this is tailor-made, like discipline-wise. Center for Public Policy, I think they have this, and they are very open in sharing the data. So when I said Dean has sent an email asking how many of them are interested to share, I think only 3%, I will not tell the numbers, 3% of faculty, they were comfortable with sharing the data and also giving the library as a facilitator to archive. But again, in the research week, just before the 2018, I think, that is when I called Robin also to have a workshop where our 10 doctoral students have attended it and 2 faculty. So that is when little bit of sensitization had happened. And when I presented in the research week, I went on to the tired journals of ABC. We have tired listing, like I think about 240 journals in ABC category. So the C category is basically of the Indian journals. So I asked my staff just to go to these author guidelines. So in those guidelines, it is written to the contributors that the journal actually owns the copyright of the data. Nowadays, I think it is changed. It is asking the manuscript submission, whoever is submitting the manuscript, that it is left to them whether they are interested to share. But at that time, I think in 2018, when we were going through this journal author guideline site, out of 130 journals, I think about 100 journals, they said that you are actually passing on the ownership for sharing the data that is submitted, because every manuscript that you submit, you have to give a brief profile of data in brief. And that data in brief, you are also submitting for peer review to the journal, where they are given a link. And when the papers are reviewed, actually the reviewers will have access to the data. So after the journal article is published, it is shared in that I think RE3 data network. And I had taken the screenshot. I said, look where your data is being shared. That is when they said, then how do you know that you have all the competence, library has all the competence? I said, it is not like that. It is a cross-discipline thing where the computer center is also responsible for giving us the server space, and we take care of the OI knowledge, whatever we have, especially with licensing, encryption, and the metadata description. So it all started at that level. Now we have initiated also an effort from library to have a data acquisition policy. Like nowadays, if we are planning to buy any data, because we spend almost 1 crore buying this proprietary data every year. So now I think the committee has decided, the library committee has decided that anytime you do request data for purchase, you have to mention your research profile, what you're going to do with that data, and also the processed data, whether you're willing to share or not. So it is at that level, and maybe I think after the data acquisition policy is approved by Dean Dean faculty, then probably they will now give the stewardship to library, especially for archiving. But they will have the password and everything. We will just describe the metadata, and it will be available only on internet. So we are talking about only at the curation and stewardship level. I think we are still a long way to go on the sharing part of it. Yeah, thank you.
So this data sharing is within the institution, right? It's not really open. So it's like, yeah, your research data is available to your own research community or your own institution. Thank you. Now, I would like to pose a question to Dr. Anant Bhan. See, in every research, because we are talking about DMP, which essentially means that when you propose research, you also propose, or you have a plan. What is your plan for what kind of data you are going to collect, whether it is survey data or this kind, and you also have to describe the data, data types, and then how you are going to store it, analyze it, and long-term preservation. All of that has to come in the DMP. But then, as a researcher, I would say when I start a research, even in an area which I'm kind of very familiar with, it's still I would say, an unknown territory to a certain extent. How is it possible as a researcher in medical sciences, I would say, particularly clinical, public health, etc., is it possible for a researcher to come to that extent of detailed DMP? What's your experience?
Thanks, Shalini. So that's a good question to ask. And I would maybe categorize my response more from an individual researcher perspective, but also an institutional perspective. One of the key challenges for both researchers and research institutions is actually having staff who are experts in this domain. There is an acute shortage of data science professionals, library science experts, and the limited numbers which graduate every year have expertise in this domain are very quickly, taken up by industry, making it difficult for research institutions to attract and retain talent. We have to recognize that this is an area which requires a lot of training and is a specific vertical of expertise which needs to be nurtured. So it's extremely important, hence, for the educational institutions to think of this as an area to invest more in, so that we have a larger cohort of graduating professionals who can be included as team members in research institutions. The second thing which I would like to touch on is that in a changing ecosystem, for many of the institutions involved in research, there's been this transition from, say, moving from physical in-house servers to online servers. There are challenges related to platforms. Which one do you use? Are there servers physically in India or not, even if you are buying an online service? Now, if you're doing with Google or if you're going with Amazon, AWS, there are rules which require you, for example, to have all of your data hosted in India. So at the back end, you need to also have expertise within the institution to know who to deal with and what kind of quality checks you need to have. On top of that, you need to figure out what actually you need in terms of, say, even online space. If you are hosting all of your data online, how many GB or terabytes of data are you dealing with? Payment plans, because these plans could be monthly in nature, annual in nature. How do you ensure that your plans are such that there is no possibility of data loss? Now, the more complicated part of also working with data is the requirements around funders or data submission. These will vary across funders as more and more funders promote open data science, but they will also have sometimes very complex requirements of how data has to be submitted. And many institutions struggle with that. In fact, if you ask institutions which might be collaborators abroad, even sometimes they struggle with the requirements. And without a supportive mechanism being available at the funder end, it might be very difficult to be able to do timely data submission. So, it's one thing to manage data, but then also, of course, in the interest of open science, you need to share it, and that becomes sometimes difficult. At the institutional level, I will also say there is this challenge of limited knowledge and understanding, as well as detailed SOPs are missing, guidelines might be missing around how to approach research data management. This is one area where, again, we need to build a lot of capacity in our institutions. We need to really have professional research management offices. How many of our institutions, for example, have Office of Research Management? How many of us have research managers where there is a whole team which is dedicated to doing this? Fortunately, I think there's been some investment in that through agencies such as the India Alliance, but still, I think a lot of our institutions would benefit greatly by having professional research managers. But it's also important for institutions to recognize that they need to plan to do research data management, right? And that would require investing in the costs of actually having systems which can do this. That includes storage, that includes the technology, that includes the formats, what kind of documentation would be needed, what kind of legal requirements are required. Around, as you know, there is this whole change around digital health and digital data management, which is happening already in India, and we might have a whole change set of requirements in the near future. So we need to be anticipating that, preparing our institutions for that, and also openness of data, because these are largely often publicly funded research projects. So it's our obligation to collect data in the proper format and also store and analyze it, but also share it in a timely basis. But there will be a requirement for us to really do a lot of hand-holding as well as investment in the infrastructure and expertise to be able to do that, right? And hopefully this conference and the discussions within it will help illuminate some of those pathways and provide best practices. Thank you.
Thank you, Anant. My next question to you very briefly is, since you are dealing with health data, what are the challenges that you have faced regarding the privacy and confidentiality issues, if you can share from your experience?
Sure. So, I mean, as a part of our work, we do a variety of research projects, some of which deals with quantitative data, some of which deals with qualitative data. Now, the steps we usually take are ensuring that the data which is coming in from our research studies is checked by competent members of the team. Usually we try to ensure that these are data management professionals. They will ensure that, for example, the data has been collected in line with the research protocol. If there are any missing entries, they will go back to the research team, which has done the data collection and ensure that those missing entries are addressed. Data is usually then cleaned and readied for analysis in line with pre-specified analysis plans. But we also need to ensure at the same time that we keep in requirements such as binding of investigators and team members when we are dealing with data, when it is being analyzed, when it's being looked at. Now, for us, privacy and confidentiality of the respondents and the data is key for any good quality research to happen. And the reason for that is if you don't ensure that there is adequate privacy built into the way the data is collected, whether that be at the health facility level, whether that be at the community level, or even if it is at the individual respondent's home, then you have the possibility that there will be a lack of trust. And if you have a lack of trust where the respondent doesn't feel that you will collect the data in a safe manner and not put them at any risk, then they might not give you true responses. And if you don't have true responses, then of course the purpose of science is defeated. So it's extremely important, hence, to think through what kind of privacy mechanisms do you need to build in. Similarly, once you've received the data, you also need to maintain confidentiality and ensuring this is done right in terms of how data is collected, transported, stored, analyzed, shared becomes important. Again, having good quality SOPs is useful. Data sharing also requires us to be cognizant of the risks involved. While all of us are supporters of open science, we also need to recognize that data sharing means that we need to be careful about who the data originally belongs to. Most of us as institutions are only custodians of data. The data is still belonging to the respondents, to the patients, to the research participants, and we have duties towards respectful handling of that data. Hence, in most cases, we will ensure that data is only shared in the identified format after adequate checks. This is actually also a regulatory requirement if you're sharing it with partners abroad or collaborators abroad. But when we share data, again, we need to be very careful around what format you're sharing it in. Are there standard reporting templates? Funders will require this, but again, at the back end, it requires the infrastructures to be able to do it. Right. The one final thing I'd also put in is that, when we keep talking about data sharing, one of the things that we need to acknowledge is that there are human resource and infrastructure constraints. And most funders will require us to submit the data within a pre-specified time. But what that usually means is large institutions, whether in India or abroad, can use the data to their advantage for publications, for grants, and for cementing their domination. Most of the smaller players in this domain, because we don't have that expertise or those set of resources, will end up being producers of data, but perhaps not adequate users of that data. So that power differential is also something I hope we will discuss in this conference, how to do how to correct that, how to ensure that these agreements around data sharing are more equitable in nature. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you, Anant. Now, my next question to is Bhakti. Very briefly, we are running out of time. So, are you having done the survey and have you initiating some, LIS training and as well as the general training? What are your plans for kickstarting this training moment, education and training moment for RDM?
Thank you. Okay, so yeah, as mentioned, currently, of course, we are lacking in official training in, as mentioned by all of the academics. Our survey also found that most of the librarians who are interested in providing these services, and of course, it was a very small number who are actually providing, only 24% of our sample is actually providing some form of RDM services to the library, to their users, and they have trained themselves. Some popular platforms which we found were, of course, one was Mantra from the University of Edinburgh. That was 50% of the sample actually had gone them and trained themselves over there, followed by, of course, we had RDMLA, which was also very popular for people to train themselves, and edX courses, which are there for this kind of training. It was interesting to find that the librarians, as well as most of the librarians of the sample, were aware of FAIR principles. So they are training themselves over there. And this is the scenario in which we are also trying to plan our training, as mentioned. And as far as kickstarting is concerned, there are certain stages which we think can be done. Very quickly, I'll just skim through that. It begins with, of course, after creating an awareness among the community, and this awareness could be about RDM and its importance, tools and technologies. Also, as mentioned by one of the previous speakers, also, researchers' needs assessment needs to be done because of the different kinds of data requirements, and at the same time, assessing the current data practices of most of the researchers who might be there within your campus. This is, of course, these are strategies that I'm talking about from the perspective of the institute level. As we all know that the policies have been in place in India since 2014, and they've been also updated. Of course, then comes the stage 3, which is competencies development. That is where we talk about training. The training can be for the researcher, and also at the we need more of collaborations. The collaborations can be both internal and external. So within internal, of course, this cannot be a one institute or one section job. We all know that administrative units, IT service centers, and research support centers need to be brought into it. We can collaborate with other associations and third parties also. We need to work on then as far as the kickstarting is concerned, we can't do that without having a policy statement. So within the institute level, each institute needs to have an RDM policy level also. And of course, then we can consider starting off these RDM services, which can deal with many things, right from the whole life cycle that was mentioned by our previous speaker. So these are some of the 7 key stages. And of course, ending with the evaluation part, which is very important also, regular monitoring and feedback of the services that we are providing. So these are the 8 key stages that we have designed. And we are also working currently with the librarians of 2 key institutions within the country to kind of devise a framework, especially for science and technology libraries to kickstart in a very formalized way the RDM services. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bhakti, for giving us an insight into what you plan to do for your training and what already the library information science professionals are doing. So I'm sure Robin Rice is very happy with knowing that everybody is using mantra. Okay, that's our mantra, right? So now over to Rama. Rama, I have founded and run a management school. So my own experience with management faculty is that it is in their DNA. That they are very profit oriented. Sharing is not in their DNA. So what's your experience?
Yeah, I agree with you. Sharing, I think they are not at all willing to. As far as stewardship is concerned, at least they have that much of faith in library that their data is safe. But having said that, what I feel that it's not only the librarian's effort that you can influence the faculty. It has to be at the dean's level, and since it is a cross-discipline domain, like we also need a lot of this expertise on calibration, on description, and also on metadata. I think when I started installing the Dataverse, and then my staff were clueless at what scheme they should be adopting for describing even the basic data sets like Annual Survey of Industries and NSSO. So in fact, when we spoke at the research week, we said that this is a cross-discipline and you have to share the expertise of research associates who work with the faculty and also the computer center. So at our place, what happens is if your whole network is outsourced and you have only one computer manager to manage, it is all the more difficult to just rely on AWS because most of our servers are Amazon Web Services. So for at least Dataverse, I said you need to have it at a local server until the faculty have the confidence of not the data is not compromised. At least that sense of security, if we are able to give, I think they obviously will trust. But as I said, I think if it is for consulting if it is their personal research, I said we don't get any public funding. But to begin with, we are starting only with the funding that happens at IIM. Like IIM also gives a lot of funding, research grant, at least 10 lakhs per annum, I think, to a faculty for writing a book or writing a journal article. So that is where the library committee came into picture, that when you are procuring such huge data sets and also data is generated, at least it should be available for other researchers. But yes, they still are not willing to share the software, the codes, or any of the things that they have, improvised the data. Like, you have the shape files and the election data at assembly constituency level, at pin code level. I remember one of the faculty actually improvised on the data, and when we tried to purchase next time, it says that no, one of the faculty has already done it, but is not willing to share. So that is when I think the efforts get duplicated whenever you want to improvise on what is not available in the data that is purchased. Yeah, thank you.
Now, we are open to questions from the audience. Very quickly. No comments, only questions, please.
As Dr. Venkatraman is online, so I have one question for him.
Is there, right? Yeah.
Yeah. So, you talked about European Open Science Cloud and also the African Open Science Cloud. So, is there any possibility of having one Open Science Cloud for Asia or maybe for India? Is there any plan?
I actually don't know the answer to India, but I know that in China that there is an Open Science Cloud that's being implemented, I think, or already there. I'm not actually sure, but it's obviously up to India and its neighbors to implement this through bilateral talks, whatever it may be, but I don't personally know the answer to that question with regard to Indian specifics.
Okay, actually there is one for Malaysia also, Malaysian Open Science Cloud, and I have another question related to that European Open Science Cloud. Is it self-archiving mechanism is there, or how one can participate in that platform?
Is it, I beg your pardon,
self-archiving?
Self-archiving?
Yeah.
You mean an automated system?
No. I have research data set, so I want to upload my research data.
Oh, you want to, right.
Yeah. Like
at the moment,
Genado. Yeah, similar to Genado.
To be honest, right now, I'm unsure about this, but I'm pretty sure of the answer, let's say. For anyone outside of Europe, I'm not sure about the ability to onboard data services into EOSC. It is available for reuse by anyone around the world, but I don't think providing into it is as simple, because they have quite a complex mechanism where checks and balances for who can actually do the onboarding of services and data. So as far as I'm aware, I'm not a technical person, so I don't want to claim too much here, but I don't think that's possible for anyone outside of Europe.
For self-archiving, you have GitHub and so many other things where you can just archive your data, right, as long as you are interested in sharing the data. Anyway, any other question? Okay, thank you so much. As I said, I do not want to muddy the water further by summarizing. You have all heard, you have all had a long day. So I would like to just take this opportunity to thank our keynote speaker, Venkat, and then our panelists here, Bhakti, Rama, as well as Anant, for sharing their views and bringing different perspectives to the table, from an exhaustive keynote to individual survey and how it can be linked to the education and training of not only LIS professionals, but as well as other researchers, and also distinctive, I would say, challenges that a management faculty research or management research poses, and also particularly from the point of view of public health and clinical data. We had Anant share his views on the challenges of and also the concerns that we have and what responsibility we have towards sharing data. With this, thank you so much, and we conclude this session.
Thank you all the panelists. Thank you, Shalini ma'am, for anchoring the session in true sense. Now I request Shalini ma'am to felicitate Dr. Bhakti Gala. Thank you. Now I request ma'am to felicitate Dr. Rama Patnaik.